Okay, thank you for joining us. I would like to start by introducing our guests today to speak to us about this very complex, important topic that we're starting to grapple with, that we've grappled in the past, and we want to really move forward in a genuine way in examining our curriculum as a division at a school. So we're very fortunate to have local experts here to join us from the U on this topic and similar topics. So Dr. Samuel Myers, Jr. is Roy Wilkins Professor of Human Relations and Social Justice with the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He received his PhD in economics from MIT. He specializes in the impacts of social policies on the poor. He's a pioneer in the use of applied econometric techniques to examine racial disparities in crime, assess the impacts of welfare on family stability, determine the impacts of food pricing on low-income communities, and to detect disparities and discrimination in government contracting. Dr. Catherine Hayes is Associate Professor in Anthropology, and she's got several important affiliate faculty positions. Those are in American Indian Studies and in RIGS, which is the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and also in the Heritage Studies and Public History graduate program. She received her PhD from UC Berkeley. Her research, based in various North American colonial contexts, stems from a challenge to the dominant narratives about the inevitability of colonial outcomes. She's particularly interested in issues of agency, negotiation, resistance, and opportunistic power, demonstrated by peoples who history once popularly regarded as having been totally powerless in context of European colonization, such as indigenous communities and enslaved Africans and African Americans. She teaches an array of courses on these topics and other topics in anthropology and archaeology. So welcome, and I just want to actually say a few words about the format today, which is a little bit different from our recent webinars. Due to how broad and complex this topic is, and how so many of us are coming at it from very different experiences and levels of understanding, we solicited questions from the audience ahead of time, and I will direct those to Drs. Myers and Hayes. They've had a chance to read the questions. There's too many to address, but we'll do our best to address the most relevant questions that they feel comfortable addressing. We're not going to have answers today or solutions. We're just going to listen and learn, and then we can discuss as a division and a school what our next steps should be in this process. So we'll begin with Dr. Myers.
Well, good morning, everybody. This is a very challenging conversation we're having, so I need to begin by positioning my comments within the context of my own profession as an economist. And I hope that you're able to draw some conclusions that are relevant for your profession. So I don't profess to be able to help your department solve your problems, but my discipline has been struggling with the issue of the methodological approaches and the relevance of economic analysis that's drawn largely, from a racist past. And so the origins of the American Economic Association and the origins of the American Economic Review, the flagship publication of the American Economic Association, is deeply rooted in racism and also deeply rooted in scientific eugenics. The idea that Black people are inherently inferior. And it's somewhat ironic that now in 2020, the American Economic Association, after the murder of George Floyd, after the Black Lives Matter marches, and after the devastating impact of COVID-19 on minority communities, it's somewhat ironic that the American Economic Association belatedly has acknowledged that we don't have a grasp within our profession of how to deal with race or racism or problems of structural or systemic inequalities. And so part of the explanation for why in 2020 people are saying that they don't have a grasp for how to deal with racism is related to the origins of the organization, where the one of the leaders of the organization wrote a book called The Races of Europe, which proposed that there were three main races, and those three races were the Nordic, there were the Mediterranean, and there were the Teutonic. And the Nordic were like the Swedes, and the Teutonic were like the Germans, and the Mediterraneans were like the Greeks and the Italians. And the argument was that the superior race was a race that was tall, that was fluent, that was intelligent. And it's interesting that this is all written by one of the first presidents of the American Economic Association. And then we have another group of empirical economists, one of whom was the head of the United States, the Bureau of Census, collecting information as we do every 10 years on the residents in America, who were particularly concerned about how do you understand wage differences and differences of income and differences in productivity between whites and blacks. And the argument was that race is really race. This is the concept of inferiority, that there are superior races and there are inferior races. Okay? This is the origins of the American Economic Association. And it turns out that during the 1930s, when there was the rise of anti-Semitism and the rise of the Nazi Party, the rise of the theoretical perspective of racial superiority, there was an outflow from Europe of a large number of economists who came to places like Princeton and MIT and others, and they were Jewish, and the Jewish economists were primarily mathematical economists who rejected this kind of racialism. And as a result, when they got to the United States, they were eager to transform the curriculum away from the institutionalist type of curriculum that focused on inherent racial inequalities, but instead a rigorous so-called objective curriculum. Now, I went to MIT. MIT's economics department is the leading economics department in the world, but it didn't even exist in 1934. What happened was that Harvard was producing mathematical economists who just so happened to be Jewish, but Harvard had a ban on hiring Jewish professors. And so its top mathematical economists who just so happened to be Jewish couldn't get jobs at Harvard. And so they started economics department at MIT. And I'm going to be very clear, the first Nobel Prize winner in economics, name was Paul Samuelson, got his PhD from Harvard, won the awards and all the things that are associated with being the top, graduate, but couldn't get a job at Harvard. So he went down the street and he got a job at MIT, and MIT began to develop a very rigorous, very exciting, very what it considered to be without the baggage of race. But what's very ironic here, it took race out of the analysis. And these are my mentors, these are my professors. And MIT was one of the first major universities in order to aggressively recruit African-American economists. So the 15 Black graduate students in the economics department at MIT in 1975. And so it's a transformation, but a transformation that had this somewhat ironic impact. My dissertation advisor told me, don't write on race. He said, because you're good. And if you write on race, you will label yourself. And what we want you to do is just do mathematical economics. And it turns out that we went from a profession that explicitly incorporated race, but in a way that was based on eugenics, biological determinism, inherent inferiorities, to eliminating race. And part of the reason why it was eliminating race, it was eliminating race, it was eliminating religion, it was eliminating culture, it was eliminating a whole bunch of things, because those economists themselves had suffered from the burden of being a part of a profession that was anti-Semitic as well as being racist. So by eliminating race, it created the veneer that the science was objective. And I hope you realize that economics wasn't always a science, but economists pushed to get to be a science different and distinct from history, from humanities, from literature, from anthropology. I'm trying to say that their view was that we are scientists. And the irony of it is that by taking race out, we had a whole generation of courses, a whole generation of doctoral programs where race simply wasn't examined, despite the fact that we had these wide racial disparities in housing and employment and income and health, things that health economists, housing economists, labor economists examine. And so by the 1990s, people were beginning to say, wait a minute, how can we analyze racial disparities in health, racial disparities in income, racial disparities in housing, racial disparities in credit? How can we do analysis of that and not analyze race? And so another transformation occurred. And by the way, different names are attached to these different transformations. So the transformation in the 30s and 40s was considered to be the creation of rational, objective economic analysis. And then the transformation that occurred in the 60s was the kind of transformation of broadening, the late 60s, early 70s, of broadening the participation transformation. And then the transformation occurred in the 90s. And by the way, in the 90s, it was also corresponding with the riots in Los Angeles. It corresponded with O.J. Simpson trial. People discovered a big divide between the Black students on campus and the white students on campus. I distinctly remember being in the room at the Humphrey School where there was this big TV screen where everybody was watching the trial. And the Black students in the room were stood up and cheered when O.J. Simpson was found not guilty. The white students cried. The white students were in tears. The white students, and this was the divide between the Blacks and whites within the room. And people began to say, what is it about the way we train people? What is it about the curriculum? What is it about education itself that could have such a big divide in the responses to something as simple as a trial? And then now we're in 2020, and we're in another episode of debates about curriculum transformation. It's just a different name this time, and the name is borrowed from what was going on in South Africa after apartheid at places like the University of Cape Town, as well as what was going on in Malaysia, and it has a new name, and of course it's going on at British universities, and the new name is Decolonizing. But I think that if you look at the historical context of debates about what we teach, about what the academy does, about what the core readings are, what's the core basis of our analysis? There have been different episodes where we've had this type of debate. So I want to put this in the context of the economics profession, which is now struggling with the fact that, we have about the same percentage of Blacks who are economists in 2020 as we had in 1975. And so we have made a lot of progress. But B, we have a lot of work all of a sudden going on race. But none of that work is grounded in any understanding of what it's like to be a Black man stopped by the police. And so we have racial profiling papers that are being published in the top economics journals. Please carefully listen to what I'm saying here. A Black economist at Harvard University who is loved by white people and disdained by most Black people has published a paper in the top economics journal which concludes that there is no racial bias in police stops and police use of force. What? There's no racial bias. And of course, this is related to what gets published in our academic curriculums. This is related to what we read in our academic curriculums. So the economics profession has kind of a canon. And that is, number one, racial discrimination can exist in the long run in competitive markets. And number two, that things like racial disparities, observed racial disparities, and police use of force, police profiling, it's efficient. It's not discrimination. It's not bias. And the reason is that, I mean, if the people who got beat up and got stopped, the people carrying drugs, or people who are engaged in illegal activities. So instead of looking at the unconditional probabilities, we look at the conditional probabilities. For those of you who are infatuated with the probabilistic and the Bayesian approaches to analyzing disparities, then I will point you to the literature at the put some references in the chat room. But my context is the economics profession has struggled for a long time with this disconnect between what we do in the classroom and what's going on in the world. And one of the unintended effects is that if I were a 21-year-old and I was trying to decide, do I want to go into economics profession, where, by the way, there's a severe underrepresentation of American Indians, of non-white Hispanics, of Asians from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Thailand. I'm saying if I were 21-year-old, I was trying to think about what do I want to do with my life, I would probably say, no, I don't want to be an economist, because the economics profession is a racist profession. It has deep roots in racism. And then they had a period where it covered up the racism, but covering it up, it ignored a lot of the analysis that's related to the things we observed. So I explained to the organizers of this panel that, you know, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm just a participant. I've lived through it, and I can share some of the historical context, but I'm eager to try to help think through some of the questions that you posed.
Thank you. That was really helpful and fascinating to hear about the history from your perspective. And I would like to turn it over to Dr. Hayes now for some of her perspective and what she's doing in her curriculum.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Dr. Myers. That it's really interesting to me to hear disciplinary histories, other disciplinary histories, and I do hear some parallels between what you're talking about and what anthropology has gone through, and particularly in that discussion about framing the discipline as a science that has been a sort of continual thread and has impacts in the way that we approach this question of decolonizing. I am a faculty member in the anthropology department, and I am trained as an archaeologist. I used to say that I am an archaeologist, and I'm sort of changing my language in the way that I approach this, and hopefully it'll be clear the reasons why. So American archaeology and other anthropologists working in North America sometimes actually, and the archaeologists in particular, sometimes get credited as being a little bit ahead of the curve when it comes to decolonizing practice. And that's nice to hear, but often people don't understand that comes from an enforcement of being brought to that place because of a truly abhorrent history of anthropology in general, but archaeology in particular, in the development of the discipline and practice. Through the 19th century, anthropologists actually became the authorities on race science. A lot of the literature that other disciplines were drawing on to bring discussions of racialized populations into their discussion is coming from anthropology. So there's a pretty deep responsibility that goes with that. For archaeologists in particular, in supporting this, although there isn't quite the distinction of subdisciplines in the 19th century, but the data that informed the studies for early race science came from exhuming the graves of thousands of Native people, Native ancestors, through the collection of material culture, of language, and of observation of peoples, largely without free, prior, and informed consent. As a profession, as a discipline, anthropology was structured its interpretations by insisting that Native people were on the brink of extinction continually, despite loud objections to that characterization. While I don't really have the time to unpack the entirety of this really abhorrent history, I did want to add in that many of the theories that anthropologists came up with, theories and interpretations, were used in devising federal policy, and often with devastating effects on Native communities. So it wasn't actually until the 1990s, 1990 in particular, with the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, that anthropologists, and particularly biological anthropologists and archaeologists, had to confront the hundreds of thousands of human remains and objects of cultural patrimony that we had collected over the years, and to rethink that as the sort of foundational material of our research. What does it mean to actually have a federal law that is framed as human rights legislation that insists that those materials be returned to the communities that they had come from? So the question then becomes, how does one fully acknowledge and teach this disciplinary foundation? And when I started teaching at the university level, I would teach this as a cautionary tale, right? Highlighting the rationale for our contemporary methods and protocols by saying this is, a history that that precedes us, that we do not do things that way anymore, but this is why we do things the way that we do now. But that is ultimately unsatisfactory. It's not doing the work that it needs to. What I realized through my years of teaching was that this was doing little to address the persistent legacies of damage, of violence that had been done by anthropologists, and persistent in maintaining ongoing inequities within the field. In teaching it in that fashion, there's no door open for actionable redress for what the discipline had done and continued to do by not addressing it in the first place. So to sort of move it into that question of how do you how have I tried to thread this into curriculum, among other things. I see three areas in particular that are really critical for shifting our teaching and our practice in order to come closer to being able to do real decolonizing. And I will also just say, when it comes to a question of, how does one decolonize a discipline when it comes to a discipline that is so completely grounded in colonialist enterprises, I'm quite pessimistic that it's possible to decolonize it, but that does not mean that there are not things that we can do to decolonize practice to sort of shift those grounds of power. So the first area is representation in the field, in the profession. Archaeology in particular continues to be mainly populated by white middle-class professionals. Although we have made significant progress in gender parity in the field, parity, not necessarily equity, but parity of numbers. So this being the case, this being the ongoing case, we have to look critically at what are the barriers to having a more realistic representation of the population as a whole in the profession itself. And there are many things. I mean, these are things that I continue to learn as I go along. One of the first and easiest ones to address is what are the founding kinds of training that are required for people to enter the field, and in archaeology, that is a field school or a training in field methods in archaeology, even though not all of us actually do field work. These are generally framed as credited, university-run credited field schools that occur in the summer. They are expensive because they cost the money for the credits. They also cost the money for travel to the location that you are doing your field training at. I'm sure people have seen these advertised of a summer experience or something like that. Go to someplace exotic or different, that involves a lot of travel to new places. That costs money. There's the support that you need. And as people came to realize later on, many students do not have the means to go a summer without working and earning money. And so not only are you paying money for this gatekeeping experience, you're actually losing money by not working. And that is an enormous and often insurmountable barrier to the field. But even beyond that, there are so many barriers that we have to consider, and those include things like, the fact that for the most part, this is not necessarily a high-paying field. Is it feasible for people to consider entering this field, knowing that it's not going to be, a high-paying job, or even a reasonably paying job. And so, it takes a fair amount of background privilege to even consider entering the field in the first place. In many ways, it is a hostile working environment, and there's been a lot of work in my field to try to address those issues. There's a culture of fieldwork that is toxic and needs to be addressed, and so this is part of the work that goes into those again, gatekeeping experiences that really sort of drive the homogeneity of the professionals in the field. So the second critical area I think we need to address is thinking seriously about the kinds of epistemic and interpretive violence that are embedded in the research itself. And by that, I mean, what are some of the unexamined narratives or assumptions that continue to thread through the interpretations? And if we're sticking here to interpretations of sites that are historic to American Indian populations, for example, we only need to go back to the earlier 20th century when anthropologists were still insisting that Native people were on the brink of extinction. That actually shows up pretty persistently in archaeological interpretations that talk about societal collapse and the abandonment of sites, always sort of looking to see an example of the rise and fall of civilization, for example, and framing civilization in ways that are very teleological and pointing to particular kinds of societies. And of course, that becomes a form of interpretive violence, because if you are, for example, a Native student who's thinking about getting into archaeology and continually being told that we have all these wonderful examples of how Native populations have failed, not accounting for the fact that their failure may have actually been the oppressive conditions of colonialism. Go figure. But there are other kinds of this really is embedded in the level of language that we use when we talk about interpretations, that makes it a very unfriendly atmosphere for many students to come into. Even just the use, the employment of discovery, that the rhetoric of discovery as part of what we do, discovering untold tales of the past, or hidden histories of the past, when there are many communities out there who already knew that history and did not need an archaeologist to come along and tell them what it was that they already knew. Or to be told that their ancestral sites have been abandoned and that there are no descendant populations when they know themselves to be descendant. So that, it's a lot of what I spend time doing in classes with students is picking on particular kinds of language that we use that shape the narratives that we tell about the past, and asking students to critically challenge those and to understand the kind of harm that they may be doing and how we can talk about them differently. So in order to be able to do that work, we do in fact need to be hearing and taking seriously all the critiques from outside the profession. There's a way in which I think, in many different disciplinary realms, things are written solely for the benefit of other people who are also in that profession. We need to stop doing that, and we also need to start listening to people who are critiquing from the outside. The third piece that I think really needs to change, and again, I think there are complicated ways that this gets embedded in curriculum, is going beyond treating our disciplinary history as simply a cautionary tale, and actually engage in restorative justice. And, you know, this is not something that we can just think about in isolation as researchers to say, you know, this is what I'm going to do. That has to be a collaborative process. I'll referring back to the federal legislation that I mentioned earlier, NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act. That piece of legislation actually requires the return of the repatriation of particular kinds of materials, but most institutions have actually interpreted that in a very narrow way. What if we were to be more capacious in our interpretation of materials that have been collected from various different communities that are subjects of research or objects of research, and think about returning those, turning those sources back to the communities from which they came. I heard about a really wonderful example recently from the University of Michigan, which had struggled, Native students and Anishinaabe communities had struggled to get the university to repatriate the human remains and associated funerary objects that the institution held. But once the institution made that sort of switch in thinking about collections, they were very open to hearing from Anishinaabe community members about other kinds of materials, and they ended up creating a whole project to return botanical materials that had been collected, and doing some collaborative work in growing those heritage seeds, and working together on a whole new project there. So that was kind of inspiring as a form of restorative justice. So this does require us to both learn how to and then to teach doing collaborative research, doing collaborative work generally, and doing it in the mode of restorative justice. How could, in my field, for example, archaeological methods, address community-based concerns and questions, rather than the researcher always being the one who's driving those research questions? And how do we prepare our students to engage in a professional context like that? Because it's not, you know, we want them to go out and do this work, but we want them to do it in a way that doesn't inflict harm by using a community as a learning experience. Again, sort of replicating the extractive process of colonialism. Excuse me. So I'll wrap this up, but you'll notice that I'm not speaking very specifically about curriculum. And that's the point that I want to make with this, is that curriculum cannot be decolonized in isolation. It has to be done also in concert with decolonizing our practice, our research, and it has to be done as well in decolonizing the very institutions that we're doing our work in. It doesn't actually help us to get very far in this work if the institution has created a set of values under which we all work that don't allow you to do this unless it is an add-on on top of everything else that you do. So the university level valuation of original research and reputation as a subject matter expert pushes faculty away from engaging in this kind of reflexive and restorative work. And if we can't find ways to change our practice, we're not going to be able to find ways to effectively teach students how to do this work, or we're teaching them to do work that ultimately they won't be able to do because institutions have not made that change. And I've found that it's actually really helpful to be very transparent with students about those kinds of institutional structures and barriers. They need to know, everybody needs to know, because this is the work of everybody, what it is that, where all those barriers are, and to strategize ways to work through this. So again, this isn't a matter of faculty or instructors sort of being the ones who solely can do this work. We do need to do this work with our students. It's impossible to do the work without them, and without community partners. So, so a lot of this is in envisioning ways in which we open up the university, make it a more porous and permeable place that's welcoming, for doing community engaged, collaborative kinds of research, and always acknowledging that we continually have to sort of re-examine and change the sort of foundational knowledge that we have in order to recognize those disciplinary legacies. So I think I will stop there. There's a lot more obviously that I could say about my disciplinary history, but it would take forever. So so I think we should just leave more time for questions.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I think we'll move on now to the questions. And I think there's a theme of people in our division and people who wrote the questions where they do want to have some specific examples. And I know this can be really difficult, but I think that you could help us a little bit more with what you've done, what works in terms of the curriculum and the teaching and so forth. One of the questions that I have that I think was directed to Dr. Myers, but either of you could answer it, is we focus a lot on methodology, similar to what Dr. Myers was talking about with respect to the field of economics. There's a lot of focus on methods that were developed by non-diverse scholars, mostly white men. And so how do we grapple with that in our curriculum, which so much of the methods in the literature is coming from non-diverse scholars, and how can we deal with that? Because I think with a lot of the students, it's not sometimes sitting well, and it can be awkward as an instructor. Have you dealt with that in your field?
So for a very quick way of responding is to remember that this is not the first time that we've had this conversation about reforming the curriculum. And so let me relate something that happened in the early 1990s when in public policy schools in particular, there were no courses on race. Even though public policy, among the top 25 public policy schools, there were no courses on race. There were courses on econometrics, courses on evaluation, courses on the politics of public affairs, on implementation and so forth, but nothing on race. And so there was a push among students of color in order to hire faculty members to teach courses on race. But the irony of it is that most of the faculty members who were qualified for a position at the University of Minnesota were people who were primarily economists or sociologists or political scientists. And like me, I was initially reluctant to be hired to teach courses on race. I said, I want to teach the economics class. I mean, the problem is the economics. The problem is the methodology, the approaches that we're using. But anyway, I ended up teaching a course on race because that's what the endowed chair was expected to do. And what happened was that this was not a required class. This was just an add-on. And so there's a distinction between transforming the curriculum and dropping something in to the curriculum. So we dropped in Sam Myers' class on racial inequality and public policy, which, by the way, was a very well-received class, which was very popular, but which wasn't required, which meant the only people who took the classes were people who were already members of the choir. And it was a fun class. I admit that it was a fun class. It was rigorous. It went through the literature. It helped develop critical, analytical thinking skills. But at the same time, the vast majority of graduates of the Humphrey School didn't know this stuff because it wasn't required. And so this is a distinction between a drop-in approach to curriculum change, kind of diversity and inclusion, and a transformative approach. The dilemma is, well, how are we going to incorporate race? How are we going to incorporate indigenous status? How are we going to incorporate all this into the statistics class? The statistics. And so the people teaching statistics classes, we don't know anything about race. I mean, at most, we can give some examples where we partition the sample between, let's say, American Indians and whites. But the sample's so small, we'll always come up with insignificant effects. And what we need is a big sample. And the big samples tend to use a dummy variable method. I'm not sure if you talk about this over in your discipline. Yeah. So we have this thing called dummy variables. Yeah. And so who's the dummy? Okay, women are the dummies. Blacks are the dummies. The dummy is the left-hand variable. And so there was a kind of conversation that was going on with the students, says, why are we the dummy? And then there was this issue of what if we're looking at women and blacks, black women? Do we have two dummies? Or do we have some sort of intersectionality approach? And so there's a literature on intersectionality that argues that it's the disadvantage of being a woman and being Black is not the sum of the disadvantage, but it turns out that the statistical methods we use don't incorporate that reality. We haven't figured out how to incorporate two related dummy variables. And if I were in the classroom and somebody kept calling me a dummy, and if I were a Black woman and I said, I'm a double dummy, what does this mean? And so this is something about the language within our field that isn't very comfortable discussion. It's easier for the dean or the social dean or the curriculum committee to add a course that deals with feminist theories of policy than it is to have a critique from the point of view of critical race theory or other feminist theory, a critique of policy analysis. Turns out that we can't do it. And so I agree with Professor Hayes that it's going to be really, really difficult to confront the deeply embedded components of the methodologies within our field without hiring a whole bunch of new people, because the people who are currently teaching the courses, by the way, we're talking about tenure promotion, we're talking about citations, we're talking about the endowed chairs, we're talking about the McKnight fellowships, they were talking about the things that are valued within the profession. I'm trying to tell you, how are you going to change your division without changing that whole hierarchical structure? I mean, just give an example about citations. So in order for something to be cited, then it has to be included. And something like JSTOR or EconLit or some of the other databases. It turns out that most of the critical work on discrimination, critical work, meaning work that disagrees with Gary Becker's model of discrimination, the model that says that discrimination can't exist in the long run. Most of that work was published in the 1970s and 80s, which was a time when there was a big uptick in the number of minority researchers, social scientists, sociologists, economists. There was a big uptick. And some of it was due to affirmative action. Some of it was due to changes that are going on in the world. But it was hard to get that stuff published in the top journals. And so many of us started our own journals. And so we have a journal among Black economists that's celebrating its 50th anniversary, and it's called the Review of Black Political Economy. But guess what? The Review of Black Political Economy was never included in the Journal of Economic Literature's list of journals. This one was paper journal. Then it became electronic. And when it became electronic, somebody just made the decision that, well, let's just use anything that's been published since 1992. And the reason for doing that is that we didn't have enough money in order to go get all of these paper copies and record them. And so anybody who's writing on racial disparities in bail in 2020, and there have been about a half dozen papers in the top economics journals, are unaware of all the work done by Black economists during the 1980s on racial disparities in bail, because it was in the Review of Black Political Economy. And the Review of Black Political Economy, or at least the editions from the 1980s, were never cataloged. I'm telling you that this is not a result of explicit, intentional racial discrimination. Rather, it was a result of ignorant, somewhat sloppy decision-making that was made back in 1990s. And so the whole field has lost a generation, a complete generation of knowledge about what African-American economists contributed. And then the other issue is what did get published in the top journals, and therefore are the things that are constantly cited. The answer is, and this is in a paper that's in the European Journal of Political Economy, if the analysis concluded that there was no discrimination, the probability was something like 3.5 times higher that it get published in a top economics journal. So that means there are gatekeepers in our profession, the editors of the journals. I'm not sure if you're aware of the fact that the editor of the Journal of Political Economy at the University of Chicago went into a rant about Black Lives Matter and why they're so irrational and why Black business owners in Minneapolis. Here's this guy, knows nothing. I'm sorry, I was about to say he knows nothing about Minnesota, but he got his PhD in economics from the University of Minnesota. And now he's the editor of this top journal at the University of Chicago. And he is writing a blog. He's writing, he's on social media, making these derogatory remarks about Black people. Well, it turns out that he's the gatekeeper. He's the editor of the journal. And if somebody writes an article that says Black Lives Matter actually contributes to an increase in reforms among police departments. And by the way, there's somebody wrote a paper on that, but got rejected from the Journal of Political Economy. If somebody writes something that challenges the conventional wisdom, it can't get published in the top journals. And this is in 2020. We're not talking about the Civil War. We're not talking about, the 1920s, the 1910s. We're talking about now in 2020. And so I suggest to you that part of the dilemma is that it's not just changing the course, it's changing the profession.
Thank you. Dr. Hayes, a question for you. This was related to the relationship between the university and the community that we reside in. And how the question is actually, how can efforts to decolonize academia translate to decolonizing the community whose land we reside on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, you know, a pretty encompassing one that I don't have an answer for, but you know, it is worth starting with an acknowledgement, for example, that of the land that the university is built on, and acknowledging the history, you know, of some pretty contested treaties whereby the land came, but even beyond that, acknowledging the recent really brilliant historical analysis that was done and published through High County News on land grant, the land grant university program, tracing exactly where the funding for land grant universities comes from, the specific parcels of land, the native communities that they were appropriated from, stolen from, and the exact amount of money that it generated for various different universities. I mean, it's a massive undertaking of archival research to have come up with this, but really points out to us, you know, some of the real specific sources of upon which the university itself is grounded, right? That without its land grant status, the university would not be what it is, and that is based on land that was unfairly appropriated from, unfairly taken from Native communities. So one of the ways that we could think about this is, you know, maybe, you know, turning to the tools of economic analysis also to think about, you know, exactly what does that translate into, you know, an illegal wealth transfer, and what is owed to those communities for what they've given in support of the university. So there's kind of an ongoing conversation about, for example, across the board tuition waivers for Native students. There already is a tuition waiver for Native students on the Morris campus, and that is based on its history as a boarding school prior to being one of the U of M campuses. But there are many people who think that, in fact, the Twin Cities campus or the whole system needs to give tuition benefits to any Native students. There's also been historical analysis that shows that the university was bailed out at a particularly critical time in its history, where it was financially struggling by a Southern slave owner named Aitken, who used to come and vacation in the Twin Cities after the Dred Scott decision made it so that slave owners felt that they could come to Minnesota without fear that their enslaved domestic staff would run away. So what does it mean to know that at a crucial moment, the university was bailed out with a transfer of wealth from somebody whose that the money was acquired through his engagement in enslaved labor, right? So so that's one way that we could start to think about this is, you know, what, in order to decolonize at that sort of institutional level, we really do need to recognize the kinds of extractive histories and practices that have happened, and acknowledge them, and you know, think about, I know that often in big institutions the R word is like, you know, don't go there, but you know, what would it mean to think about reparations in a situation like that? So, and I think, you know, I think it starts with knowing that history.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's what I'm really taking away from this morning, is in the conversations that we've had recently, is what you said. It's, you know, the historical perspective. We want to know what to do to improve and to make things better, and we it's going to take a while. It's going to be a very long, complicated process. And so we'll stay in touch with you for sure and reach back out to you. There's so many more questions, and I might ask you with the questions before us, if you might be able to answer some of those offline, and then we could share those. And I know they're not really answers, but it's more like a conversation and a dialogue, because people have sent a lot of questions in and we are out of time. So I just really, really want to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. And we all just really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.